All right, now I'm on. All right, good morning, church. We're going to do a little bit of recap because show of hands, who was not here last week or did not get this lecture? Okay, great. So there's 4 of them. And did you see it online or anything like that? We're completely fresh here. All right. All right. Welcome to the class of the best and worst of humanity, and if there's time, the Gospel of Matthew. I have been upfront about this, so we're still not going to get into the Gospel of Matthew today, but I've been upfront about what this class is, the best and worst of humanity, and if there's time, the Gospel of Matthew. I'm also going to go off the syllabus in week 2 because we were going to talk about the Beatitudes, but to be honest with you, my parents are going to be here next week, and I thought that would be a better one for them to show up for than the ones when I am a little more sarcastic. They prefer me. They prefer me as a pastor who's a little more straight-laced than I actually am. So I figured that'd be a good one for them. So we're going to talk about the best and worst of humanity and how to read the Bible. If you're a longtime follower of this Bible study, I try every year to reframe how we read the Bible so that you could be good readers and scholars. And so what I'd like to look at today is how the spiral influences the way Scripture is written and interpreted. Scripture is written and read. Also, if you have a question or a comment and you would like to be recognized, I invite you to raise your hand. Mr. Stephen Craig's got a microphone. Do you have a microphone? He's got a microphone, and I'm going to ask that you speak into the microphone because we are recording these, and there's nothing worse than watching a recording where somebody answers a question that you never heard asked. So, a little bit of recap. This is the spiral, and I'm gonna bother the tech people extremely because I'm going to go all the way back in my slides here. The first, if you're new here, the micro story of your life tells the macro story of humanity, okay? And that's a sort of a hard way of saying when we as a species developed, let's assume that we evolved from creatures in the ocean. And we didn't know how to walk or crawl. So in our very first iterants of what became evolved to be us, we were in water and we had to learn how to walk on land. In the macro story, your life, your story, Janine's life, Janine was made in a womb, which was actually made in water. She was made in liquid. And then we sort of all get spit out on the ground in the same way as a child that we were as a species. And then we couldn't walk. In the same way, when we're born, we can't walk. We learn to crawl, and then we learn to walk. So the micro story and the macro story mirror each other. And the part that becomes interesting is what happens after that. And what happens after that is we all evolved in the same order, on the same progression. Some of us do that faster. Some of us do that slower. Some of us go halfway there and stop. We stop going. We stop growing. And I'm relating that to different stops on a train. Every single stop you have to make, but you choose how long you spend in that. And so that's what the spiral does. The spiral are different stops. There are 2 kinds in the spiral. There are warm colors, which are red, orange, and yellow, and there are cool colors, which are purple, blue, green, and turquoise. And when you see that, we go from one to the other. Every stop, we vacillate. So think about you're on a train, and when you get to the train stop, when you get to red, you can only get off this way. And then when you get to blue, you can only get off this way, okay? Some of us, maybe all of us, prefer either the warm colors or the cool colors. And so when I prefer warm colors most of the time, and when I get to a warm color, I stay longer. And then when I get to a cool color, I get off the train and I'm like, nah, this is not for me. And then I get back on the train or I get on the next train, right? So we progress, but the important thing to remember also is that not everybody cares to progress. A lot of people get where they're going and then they stop. They don't want to go any further. And when you show them things like spiral dynamics, they go, that's great, but still pass. I'm happy where I am. I think one of the most important things you can learn in spiral dynamics is that the world is a better place when we're not all the same. And so when you look at people and you say, how can you vote that way? How can you believe that? How can you live your life that way? Why do you get up and go to church? Don't you know it's opiate for the masses? Why do you even do that, right? Wake up, man, use your brain, right? We find ourselves in echo chambers and communities that say the world, that talk about the world the same way that we feel it, okay? And so one of the things that we want to do today is just expose you to that. And I talked about the micro story of how individuals, and today I want to talk about the big story. So just a quick overview. Beige is the first level. It's a very animalistic phase. Kill or be killed. It's not thinking much about tomorrow, and it doesn't have language that changes everything. Purple is when we add language. Again, in the macro story, we add language, and in the micro story, you're not born learning to talk. You learn to verbalize your feelings and your thoughts. And then that first purple stage is a spiritual one. It has a lot to do with gathering people together in sacred rites and ceremonies and coming of age. There's a lot to do with priests and elders and magic. And 5% of the global population is still here, still in purple. The next one is red, which is a very powerful place. So the cool colors tend to represent times when we're making decisions as a group, and warm colors tend to be when we're making decisions as a singular person, or we put ourselves first. And in blue colors, we put the community first. Reds are a particular want to be in power. It's a dog-eat-dog world. I got to go and I got to get mine. I got to get my slice of the pie. I mean, we actually say these things, right? We operate out of this. We elect people. 20% of the world population is still here in red, and we elect leaders who mirror what we want, okay? Kim Jong-un is a red leader, right? Vladimir Putin is a red leader. They show you strength and nothing else. We're pretty sure Kim Jong-un had COVID. Remember, we didn't see him for like 3 months, right? And when he came back, they said, he's basically immortal, right? And he can't die. We see this a lot. A bunch of American presidents have been red, including our last president, Donald Trump, who in every interview will tell you, I am the best. Listen, nobody knows this better than me. You have to trust me. And red tends to have that sort of vibrato to it. And you can see, of course, why it's attractive to people, because we want a leader who's strong, and we also want a leader who's capable, and that sometimes becomes the issue, and we've seen that around the world too, where we get a strong leader, but they might not actually be as capable as they say that they are. Most of our American presidents are blue. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Blue is how churches were founded. This is the builder generation, right? They fought a war. They have a high level of patriotism to the group. They come back from the war. They have a bunch of babies, but only in wedlock. And they start building churches and societies and rotaries. So we know this story. Law and order is really important. 55% of the global population, so the majority of humans, are still here in blue. The next phase is orange. Orange is an individualistic sense. Again, it's a warm color, and this is the age of enlightenment. This is scientific breakthroughs. This is technology. This is Bill Gates. This is how am I going to thrive in a free market economy? And so where you find yourself on this affects the way that you talk about everything. This is a theory of everything, okay? Take one issue. Somebody give me one issue that's on the global scene right now. All right, great. I heard climate change. Thank you. In orange, climate change, an orange person would say, yeah, I'm not denying that climate change is real, but we have to incentivize the companies so that they become this. See, if we put a tax on what they produce, then they will self-regulate. Orange is very big that governments and people and businesses should self-regulate, and you change the rules of the game to get the approach that you want. Okay, let's just go backwards just for a thought experiment. Let's talk about climate change as blue. If you wanted to pitch climate change to blue, you would talk about their coming generations, their children, their children's children, right? People in blue love to use last names. They love to talk about your family of origin. They love to talk about your nationality of origin. So you would say, think about 3 generations from now. What kind of world do you want to leave? What's your legacy, okay, for climate change? If you were in red, you would say, we are all going to get wiped out if we don't address climate change, okay? We are going to die if we don't. Good luck convincing a bunch of people in red of climate change. That's kind of where we are right now most of the time. And purple, you would say, God is punishing us because we have not been faithful. We have neglected to take care of the earth. Remember in Adam and Eve where we were supposed to take care of the earth, okay? That same issue, we could go through all of these. And it doesn't matter the issue. It could be a refugee, it could be abortion, it could be voting rights. We could talk through it from each one of these, right? And so people are remarkably consistent, I find, when it comes to spiral dynamics. And understanding this enabled me to talk through them. This is not on my list. This is a tangent, but I think it's really important. The guy who wrote the book, Spiral Dynamics, Don Beck, he says that he was involved, once he was shown this by somebody else, and he was convinced he was going to help the world with this. And so he helped some tribal leaders in Africa stop feuding. And after they stopped the war, they said, that was great, thanks for helping us, but our real problem is AIDS. We have an epidemic. We have an AIDS epidemic, right? This is the 80s and the 90s, okay? It's still an epidemic, by the way. And he said, okay, well, in America, we teach safe sex, right? Let's give people condoms. And he said, that'll never work. That'll never work. And so he says in the book, you can't solve what people perceive to be a purple problem with an orange solution and think that it's going to go well. You can't walk up to a tribesman or to a shaman and say, this thing, this condom or this shot is going to help you. It's going to save you. They're going to say, I don't know what you're talking about, but until my shaman tells me that that's right, until my priest tells me, until my witch doctor, until my elder sees it that way, I'm not going to believe you. And so Don Beck made it his mission to go talk to all of the shamans and the spiritual leaders and tell them that this thing was a gift from God and that if they used it, they could solve their epidemic. And then they started to make progress in, you see this issue, okay? You cannot use a different color to solve the problems in somebody else's color. It won't work, okay? It'll make Thanksgiving miserable, okay? If you approach people who are in red with orange, and definitely not green, and this is where a lot of you are. How many of you took the test and found out that you were green, that you were mostly green? I realized that the test got hacked somehow. That's so odd. Some people took it, and other people, it was like a Russian site. I am meaning to work on that. I'll try and do that this week. Green's the next stop on the train. It's a cool color. In green, we learn about human rights. This movement started 150 years ago, but it really picks up steam in the 1960s. A bunch of you have been green since the beginning. As my kids would say, you would be the OG green. You've been green since it came to America. Human rights, civil rights, women's rights. You have a flag out in front of your yard that says, we believe women's rights are human rights. Black Lives Matter, right? Am I talking to you? Yeah, okay? There are lots of you in this congregation. The risk for green is what Don Beck calls the mean green. Green can be meaner to everyone else than virtually any other color. And I know that's going to come to a shock to you because you're like, no. You understand, I'm all human rights. Yes, except the way you talk to people, you're deconstructing them because green is all about deconstructing. And when you deconstruct people who are in orange and blue and red and purple, they find great offense to that. And so what you really want to do if you're green is to help people move up the ladder, but they need to move up the ladder. You can't deconstruct red for someone who's purple and expect them to move into red. You can't. You need to help them find their way from purple into red, red into blue, blue into orange, and orange into green. You can't skip any of these steps. And so for many people who are women's rights are human rights, and we're going to put pronouns on all of our name tags, and we're going to talk about climate change, and we're going to compost and judge everybody who throws away their bananas, and we're going to talk about making the government, we just need to, I've heard that lots of people in green say this, okay, well, how would you solve the issues of our world and the government? We need to start all over. Is that going to work? Say no. No. Because if we start all over, we're back in beige. If we start all over, we're back in beige, okay? So the risk for green is that you become mean, that you are deconstructing a bunch of people who don't want to be deconstructed, okay? And so your deconstruction, which you find purifying and helpful, they find offensive, they find dangerous, and so when you say we need to tear the whole thing down, somebody in blue goes, see, this is exactly why we don't want you in our politics. You're just going to tear everything down. Don't you have respect for the founding fathers? I mean, what they did was brilliant, right? And then green comes into church, and they're like, well, that's great, but we need to get rid of all of the racist hymns. And blue goes, are you going to throw out the whole book? Are you kidding me? This is my ancestors' heritage. Are you calling my grandfather a racist? Because he was not a racist. And then they say something that's slightly racist, right? Green is going around taking down statues, right? And blue is saying, you didn't know my great-grandfather. Do you feel this? You feel this conflict? And so when green starts to get a foothold in the world by the election of leaders that it brings, blue responds by electing red leaders. Do you see that? We talked about this last week. Brexit, Donald Trump, Macron, the guy in Brazil, Kim Jong-un, Vladimir Putin, all of these are red leaders, and so blue responded. 55% of the world's population is in blue. Blue is responding to the deconstruction of green with red. And the sooner you get that, and you realize that, you're going to learn to meet people where they are. You have to meet people where they are. You can't have them skip steps. All right, I've spent more time on this than I intended to. So that's the macro story of your life, okay? The micro story of your life is that you started out as beige, as a baby, just as a species we started out in water. You learn how to walk just as our species did. You learn how to talk just as our species did. And then you develop an identity, and you go through these exact same stages. Every human goes through every single stage. That's why it's called the theory of everything. It can be applied to business, education, philosophy, and especially religion. Religion is an important part of the human experience. And there's a bunch of people in green who are missing how beautiful and wonderful religion can be. Somebody say amen. There's a bunch of secular humanists out there, okay? And they love to have coffee with me. Because they're pretty sure that they're going to wake me up, right? This is that thing I told you last week. When I sit on an airplane, and the few times I tell people what I actually do, no one asks me for advice. They tell me their theology, 100% of the time, okay? So when people are in green, and I lost my train of thought. What was I saying? I have no idea. Green goes to yellow. And this is a huge jump It is not the same train. We talked about stops on a train. You have to switch trains to get to yellow. Okay? Yellow is the integration of all of the previous colors. Yellow learns how to adapt to specific situations by speaking the color of the person. When somebody in blue invites you to a fancy dinner party, you don't show up in ripped jeans, right? You're never going to connect with them on a deep level if you wear Hawaiian shirts to traditional worship service. They are not going to trust you, okay? Our son Thomas just dyed his hair pink, right? He's making a statement, cool. But some people are going to treat you differently because you chose to do that, right? Totally cool. Yellow is when we learn how to reintegrate. And the most beautiful part about this for me is the reintegration of science and religion into the beautiful mystery that creation is. We have no idea. Stephen Craig let me borrow his book. What's it called? The Whole World is Made Up, or we don't know what we're talking about. It's a science book. Yeah, we really don't know, okay? We don't understand the world that we live in. We've got some math that works on really small things, and we've got some math that works on really big things, and when you put them together, the calculator explodes. We do not have a unified field theory. We do not know. We think we know about a Big Bang, which, by the way, is a theory, but it only explains when. It doesn't explain why. We don't know if we live in a universe or a multiverse, right? But when we see that the beautiful mystery that's all around us is baked in, all of our facts and all of our beliefs are so tied together. This is a beautiful world. 1% to 2% of the world population is here in yellow. I told you that I think there's some worldly. I mentioned Barack Obama last time, and I regret that I didn't tell you Gandhi. I didn't tell you Jesus, right? Nelson Mandela, the Dalai Lama, Desmond Tutu. These are people who are so next level, and when you meet them, you know that they're next level. And one of my favorites, Brian McLaren, that we brought here a couple of years ago, he wrote this great book with a silly name called Why Did Moses, Buddha, Jesus, and Muhammad all cross the road? That's the name of the book. And the answer was to get to the other. He says people have been feuding in these people's names, but if they got together, they would love it. And he imagines conversations between Buddha and Jesus and Muhammad and Moses sitting at a table, laughing and loving each other. And of course they do. That's what they're all for. But when we think about them, we're like, oh man, I'm going to get a tattoo of one of those and I'm going to go fight the other ones, right? That's because we are stuck in another phase. But they're in yellow. They are in yellow. So whenever somebody wants to come up and talk to you about world religions, listen to them. Hear what they have to say. That does not mean that all world religions are equal, but it does mean that we all have a common humanity, and therefore we perceive the world in very common ways. All right. Today I want to talk about the best and worst of humanity and how to read the Bible using spiral dynamics. Now that we've talked about your macro story, micro story, I want to talk about the macro story and talk about it using Scripture. And if you're new to my heresies, you probably haven't heard me talk about Adam and Eve. How many of you have heard? How many have heard me talk about Adam and Eve? All right. So for about the half of you who haven't, the story of Adam and Eve is a coming-of-age story. It just is. It is. And when you realize that, you see things differently. And let's start with the punishments, okay? Adam and Eve eat a fruit. The word is not apple. There are no apples in the Middle East. And as soon as they eat the fruit, they realize that they're naked, and they put on fig leaves. And why would there be fig leaves at the bottom of an apple tree? There aren't. It's a fruit called a fig, which is in the Middle East. They eat of the fruit, and as soon as they eat of the fruit, they realize that they're naked. God comes looking for them, and they hide. Then God says to Eve, because you have done this, you will have pain in childbearing. And God says to Adam, because you have done this, no longer can you just walk around however you want. You're going to have to till the soil. You're going to have to work hard every day, okay? So eating the fruit and the talking snake is a story about two people having sex for the first time. It's clearly what the story is about. All of the nudity, all of the hiding, all of the childbearing, all of the working the soil point to this being a euphemism for having sex for the first time. And by the way, in ancient Mesopotamia, a talking snake is a reference to a penis, and a fruit is a reference to a womb. That is just true. That is just what happens in ancient Mesopotamia. And I've ruined that story for you, probably. But once you realize that, it actually becomes the spiral dynamic story of moving from beige into purple. It actually becomes the story of, gosh, it sure did feel like paradise before we had responsibilities. It becomes the story of, gosh, we have to grow up because those little people looking up at us, they think we're in charge. Once you read it that way as a story, you realize that it's a story about adulthood. And what happens next is that their boys are terrible. One of them kills the other one, all right? So you start to see that story as a movement from beige animalistic pleasure to purple. By the way, God is saying to them, if you continue to have sex, the circumstance will be that you're now going to have children to take care of, right? And then purple moves into the story of Abraham and Sarah, which is also a story about having children, where now we see it as a miracle. You think that's intentional? Yeah, it is. Because the first time it was an accident, the second time it was a miracle. It's two people who couldn't, who wanted, desperately wanted, and they're really old now, right? The Bible tends to exaggerate how old people are, but 99 and 90, right, is what the Bible says that they are. Obedience is a mystical reward by God. That is a purple story. Your obedience. Remember, God calls Abram out of the land of Ur and into the promised land to have children. And then that story gives way to the story of Noah and the ark, where obedience being mystically rewarded by God and your personal power to rise above the populace. By the way, I researched the word populace for like an hour yesterday. I'm still not sure I'm using the word correctly. Feel free to correct me after church. There's like 3 different spellings for the word, and I'm still not sure which one means what, so I gave it a shot. I was going to just change the word, and then I thought, you know what? We all need to grow and try harder, so I don't know. But let me know if it's right later. I'm sure you will. Purple finds its way into red in this story. You see, this is a story about wickedness. It's actually a story about homicide, right? God kills all but one. Think about that for a second. God kills all for one. There is mystical punishment toward you living your life in an unhealthy way, right? Now, we would say there's actually natural punishments to living your life in a bad way, but the Bible superimposes a mystical story on it, right? By the way, there's an ancient flood story in virtually every civilization, right? Glaciers melt. Sometimes there's a big hurricane. There's all kinds of these mystic flood stories. And the flood story is almost always interpreted as, we did bad, and now we're being punished. I mean, that's around the world, right? But the story of Noah is interesting because it's a story of God telling Noah to have agency, right? This isn't, oh, God did something to wipe out everybody, and I climbed a tree and survived. This is, God told me to take up my own power and build an ark, even when everyone else was making fun of me. Do you see how that's a revelation story? By the way, I forgot this, but back to the story of Abraham. Do you remember the story of Abraham sacrificing Isaac? And that story doesn't sit well with any of us, right? And in that story, it's a story about obedience, right? God is testing Abraham to see how obedient he would be. But it's also an evolution story of justice, because there was child sacrifice in the time of Abraham. There was child sacrifice in the name of God in the story of Abraham, in the time of Abraham. And that story was a pivotal countercultural moment when Abraham does not sacrifice Isaac. And God says, I don't want your child offering. I want your burnt offering, your ram. And then later, God says through Jesus, even your burnt offerings that's not what I'm here for. I want your life as a living sacrifice. So that's an evolution of justice. You see that evolution very clearly. And if you're going to read the Bible in a way that's helpful, I'd love for you to see it in a way where human consciousness evolves to understand God's benevolence and grace every day. If you read the stories that way, the stories that used to offend you, then you start to say, wow, we really did move there. Wow, we went from child sacrifice to living my life as a living sacrifice, and that's kind of a beautiful transition. We talked about Noah, and then this story of Moses comes along, which is the same kind of thing. Obedience and your personal power, and you will rise above oppression. This is the story of Moses. He kills somebody out of red, which is like an impassioned sense, right? Somebody was whipping somebody and he didn't like it, so he killed him. Then he runs away. And when he runs away, God calls him back. And when he calls him back, he's called to be a leader, to be the chosen leader of his people, a one leader for the many. That's very red, right? And he says, I'm not good enough. I can't speak the language or whatever. And God says, no, you're going to go and you're going to do this and you're going to be the leader and I'm going to help you. And part of the reason that he wins over Pharaoh is because he performs magic, doesn't he? Somebody say yes. You awake out there? Yeah, he performs magic. Remember, the Pharaoh's got all these other magicians, and then Moses goes up there and he turns his staff into a snake and back again, and he does some other of these magic tricks. That's very, very much a story of purple leaning into red. And then you get this story of Joshua, just one of my favorites. Moses doesn't make it to the promised land. He dies in Egypt. And Joshua is the leader who takes the people to the promised land. And he gets there and he says, look, there's going to be a bunch of other tribes that want you to sign up. But for me and my house, we are going to continue to serve the Lord. We are not going to be swayed. That is that is the most purple statement ever, right? You're going to be tempted to go off and do new things, but remember who you are, right? And he doesn't say, as for you and your house, he says, for me and my house. It's a personal decision to follow God. That's very red from the leader of Joshua. Also, they march around the city that falls down. That is a mystical reward for following God, right? Then you get a bunch of these great stories. I call these superhero stories. I think that's really the genre that they are. These are comic books. Esther, particularly Ruth, Esther, and Daniel. These are comic books. If you remember the story of Daniel, he gives up eating meat and he becomes stronger than everybody else. He never gives up his Jewishness. And because he follows God, the lions can't hurt him, right? Imagine that as a comic book. That's the genre there. Esther is a very similar story. She's Jewish and she's in the court of the Persians. The Persians are like 30 times larger than the Hebrews, right? I mean, their culture is extremely advanced, okay? She's from Pilot Mountain, North Carolina, and she goes all the way up to New York City. And the king says, she is the most beautiful in all the world. That's what that story is, right? Because the women from Pilot Mountain are the most beautiful in the whole world. We are on the map. And that's obvious, right? If you're Hebrew, that's obvious. Of course we are. Of course we are. Carolina girls, best in the world. What are you going to do? And in that story, Esther, she stands up to an entire regime, right? She uses her personal power as queen to bring about a large change that is incredibly violent. You notice the theme that all the purple turned red are incredibly violent sort of scenes, right? And then you get to the kings. So in the beginning, when they settle in Jerusalem, There's a book of Judges, and they decide we don't want kings. We're resisting kings because we are a tribe. The whole the book of Judges is about being purple together. And they're like, nah, we need to go to war. And if we're going to go to war, we might as well have a king. And they're like, well, how are we going to pick a king? We don't have like a lineage yet. And they're like, well, we're going to pick this guy Saul because he's the tallest. And they do. And Saul becomes the first king. He doesn't last very long. People question his leadership. So, even though David's not as tall as Saul, we tell a particular story about David so that he shows up incredibly masculine. And what is that story? David versus Goliath. Right. We've got to reframe him as red. He's not the firstborn or the secondborn. We tell this whole hilarious story of Jesse, right? And the prophet Samuel comes to Jesse's house, and he's like, are these all your sons? You got any more? He's like, well, I got the runt. He's like out there with the sheep. You want me to call him in? He's like, yeah, right? And he brings him. He's like, this is it. And Jesse's like, all right, if you say so, you're the prophet, right? And then it takes one rock, okay? So there's so much strength in that story of David. And then David is the king that we remember as the first king. But if you get that answered the question, if you ask the question if you give the answer on Jeopardy and are made to come up with the question, who was the first? This person was the first king of Jerusalem. The answer is not David; it's Saul. But we stopped telling the story of Saul because David is more red than Saul. Saul was tall; he got us through a war, and then we were done with him. And then David does all of the red things. He sees a woman bathing that he wants, and he makes her his. And God punishes. That's a purple-red story. Do you feel that? Somebody say yes. You feel that that's what's happening there? And then they have a child, and the child doesn't live, and that's all a divine punishment for his infidelity. And then he learns from that mistake, and then he's got a couple of kids, but he loves Bathsheba the best, and so her son becomes king, even though he's not the next to the throne. So far, we've had 3 kings, and we haven't followed the rules about who the succession is one time, okay? And then the kingdom splits in half after Solomon, right? Solomon lasts for 40 years. He's very, 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 very wise. He's very, 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 very strong. He has 100 horses with a stable that can hold 100 horses. Guess how many horses there are in Jerusalem? He has an army of 200,000 men. Guess how many men actually live in Jerusalem? About 10,000, right? And that's assuming that they're all able-bodied and are willing to go to war, and not everybody's willing to go to war, right? And then Solomon sort of peters off. And then the second half of how we tell the story of Solomon, he's kind of a bad king. And then out of his children, we can't decide which one to make king. And one of them becomes king of the southern area, right? They have a civil war. They put up their Confederate flag. And then some of the people go up north. And they settle the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And they do that for 200 years. And then the northern kingdom gets wiped out by the Assyrians. And the southern kingdom says, well, that's because you were bad and you left us 200 years ago. Told you so. Not that it has anything to do with the fact that the Assyrians actually came from the north, and so they had more armies to fight the northern people, and when they got to the southern people, they had fewer armies, and King Sennacherib of Assyria says, I for sure won that battle, and King Hezekiah of, my professor's shaking his head, King Hezekiah of the southern kingdom withstands the battles, basically because they've got a wall, and Sennacherib is tired. The Assyrians go back home. Both people declare victory over the war, right? Because that's what red does. And then the northern kingdom is no more. And then the southern kingdom takes over the northern kingdom again. Then you get prophets. Prophets are the cool to the warm. If you got a king in power, we need to balance that with some mystical advisory type who warns you about the problems. And this is where Jeremiah and Isaiah and some of the other prophets come in. Jeremiah is there when Hezekiah is at war with Sennacherib. when the Israelites are at war with the Assyrians, and Isaiah is there, and he's like, I think y'all have been bad, and God's mad at you, and I think we need to repent, okay? Then the next big war that happens are when the Babylonians come to town, and then Jeremiah is there. He's advising the king, and he says, I think y'all have been bad. I think we should do something new. There's a story of actually how they find ancient scrolls buried in the ground of the Torah, and Jeremiah brings them to King Josiah and says, this is the law. I found it underground. Our faith has been hidden. Our identity has been hidden. And now we've got to pull it up out of the ground, and we've got to go back to being purple, and we're going to make Israel great again. And then Josiah tears his shirt, and he says, we're going to recommit to the Deuteronomistic history and the Torah, and we're going to live as God wants us to, and that these people are going to go away. And then Josiah dies in battle. And his sons are worthless, right? If you raise your children by sheltering them, once they're adults, they're sheltered, right? And so the story of Josiah's 3 children and 1 uncle, which is sort of this very Hamlet, very Lion King thing of like the uncle takes the throne when he's not supposed to. That story is about how they didn't follow God well. And so now they're being wiped out by the Babylonians. And that's exactly what happens. And then they go into exile in Babylon. They find their way back. They reestablish the religion, which is very blue. There's a bunch of things that happen, including the story of Jonah, which is beautiful. Then they fight back against the Greeks and the Romans. The Maccabees do. That's in the Apocrypha. And then the Romans defeat the Greeks in Greece. And then the Romans declare themselves emperors over the whole civilization. And then Jesus happens. Now, the Gospels were written after Paul. Okay? Paul's letters came first. Turn to your neighbor and say, the Gospels are written after Paul. I know, that's hard for us. That's hard for us because the Bible, the New Testament starts with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then Acts, and then Romans, okay? But all of those letters Paul wrote, he wrote before the Gospels were written, okay? So from a literary perspective, Paul is very blue. What does Paul walk around and tell you to do? Do better. Be good. Follow Jesus. Follow Christ. Be an example. For I am convinced that there's nothing that can separate us from the love of God. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, and self-control. Faithfulness and self-control. He's going around telling you to be good, to be together. We are united in the body of Christ. That language could not be any more blue. Paul couldn't be any more blue, which is why a lot of Christian churches are still in blue. Because if you want to follow Paul, this is where you land, right? The Levitical laws are very purple and then very blue. If you want to read the Bible that way, you come up with a very particular understanding of who God is. And then this guy Jesus comes along. Anybody want to guess what color Jesus is? Want to pitch to me what color Jesus is? I think we could argue that Jesus does all of the above. Which is really comforting to me because it tells me that using the language of Jesus, I can talk to people in any color. This is a really big tool for us. This is a really big win. It also means, however, that people can justify staying in purple and red and blue and orange and claim Jesus. Does that explain a lot to you? It explained a lot to me when I found that out, okay? How is Jesus purple? Pop quiz. How is Jesus purple? Yeah, miracles of abundance, right? Miracles of making people well who were not well. He changes the game for people, right? And everywhere he goes, people ask him for signs, which is very, very purple. How is Jesus red? He does. He overturns the tables in the temple. Yeah, he does several things that are like a boss, right? My favorite is when the rich man comes for him. Says, I'm a rich man. I've done everything right my whole life, and I got prosperity gospel. I got it all. What should I do now, Jesus? Jesus says, sell everything you got and follow me. Is there a more alpha statement in the history of the world? No, that is boss, right? John the Baptist says about Jesus, I must decrease so that he might increase. The disciples say to Jesus, there are eunuchs, and then there are eunuchs for the kingdom of God. We've basically given up our manhood to follow you. And Jesus says, yeah, you did, but don't think that that makes you great, because you did the right thing, right? On and on and on. Jesus is very red, and if you are in red, there is a lot of Jesus that you identify with, right? People in red, I'm going to pick on you for a minute. People in red, when they think about naming a church, call it Christ the King. Right? We're going to call it Grace or Good Shepherd or Saint somebody. We're not going to do that. Christ is the King, baby. Was Christ ever a king? No. Would Christ appreciate you calling him a king? No. No. But that's where we go when we're in red. Christus Victor. Christ is king. He is victorious. He is triumphant. And then when you're writing hymns and you're in red, you write hymns about how Christ is king, how Christ cannot be defeated, right? And then when you're in red and you're planning a funeral, you pick all hymns about a mighty fortress is our God. A mighty fortress. Not a weak fortress, not a all are welcome kind of fortress. A mighty fortress, right? I want a God who's hard to get to, right? That language hits us odd when we think about it, right? And so green all day is just deconstructing where you were. But when they deconstruct, it comes off as condemnation. And that's not helpful, because it's actually not true. The guy who wrote A Mighty Fortress Is Our God is Martin Luther, who had an amazing amount of faith and was willing to live for Jesus every single day of his life. Does that mean he got it all right in the 21st century? No, we didn't live in the 21st century. So we can't just deconstruct. Yellow is how do we appreciate the good and warn people of the bad, the best and worst of humanity at every level. The goal of yellow, like Jesus, is to speak your language to you. He goes to the religious leaders, think about this, who walk around all day telling biblical stories, and he tells them parables. Because parables is a non-conflicting, non-judgmental way to teach you a lesson. It's beautiful, it's elegant, it's gorgeous. And a lot of those parables show up as blue and orange and green, right? The story of the parable of the Good Samaritan is the bluest parable of all time, right? What happens? Well, there's a priest and a Levite, and they see a man in a ditch, and they are too caught up in their purple laws to help him. But then a Samaritan comes by who loves God and decides that actually following God is to help this man who's in the ditch, and he takes him, and he loves him. Even though he's a stranger, he puts him up at a hotel, and he bandages him up, right? Blue can raise money in a stewardship campaign with that story every day, right? Every single day. Blue is very proud of that parable, and they should be. We should be. That's a gorgeous parable. But not all the parables are blue. There's a parable that really pisses off the orange, and we're going to do it later on. It's called the parable of the workers in the vineyard. And in the workers of the vineyard, it tells a parable where the owner pays everybody the same, even though one of them only worked 2 hours, and one of them worked all day. And Orange throws a fit about that parable. Absolute fit. They would take that parable to the Supreme Court. They for sure would, right? Right? And the way we talk about our economy, the way we talk about Jesus and the way we talk about our economy come from the stage that we are in. And we don't realize how incredibly linked our economics and our following of Jesus are. They are incredibly linked. The way we talk about money, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also, and not the other way around. It is not where your heart is, there your treasure will be. Oh, no, no, no. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Blue believes that you should tithe. You don't have to sit around and think about, what I could do with all this money. It's not even a question of that, right? We set it and forget it. We give God our best, our first fruits. We dress up for church. There's a lot of following Jesus in that. There's a sacrifice to that. Jesus as a sacrificial figure on the cross is incredibly blue, right? Try taking this cross down from the sanctuary and see what happens to you. I tried it. It didn't go well. Right? We are incredibly tied to our symbols. We love our symbols, yeah. Jesus also shows up as orange, right? Orange is this scientific, it's a self-expression. Orange is sort of a self-made man, and Jesus fits that narrative. He grew up with nothing. He was charismatic. He was attractive. People followed him. People trusted him. He worked all the time. Orange loves that story of Jesus who's always trying to find rest and never gets it, right? Jesus who heals people, who sees people, who travels, who questions things. Orange has a scientific mind and loves that. And green people find Jesus to be green. Isn't that incredible? We find the Jesus we're looking for. Isn't that incredible? Yeah. Green people find Jesus deconstructing the religious establishment. Green people find Jesus as standing up for women. Green people find Jesus who's interested in human rights, who intentionally says nothing about homosexuality in his entire ministry. Green people will tell you that that's on purpose, right? Not that it wasn't an issue, because it actually just was. They had homosexual people in Jesus' day. It just wasn't that interesting of an issue, right? That's our issue. That's not their issue, right? 100 years from now, they're going to judge the heck out of us for eating meat. You know this, right? The future is going to condemn you and tear down all of your statues because you eat meat of slaughtered animals and pretend like you don't, okay? You have not evolved to the highest level of human consciousness. You are on the journey. Jesus, and especially Matthew's gospel, which I promise we're going to talk about next week, exhibits all of these signs. And so one of my prayers for you in your homework is to see how other people could also experience Jesus even when they're in different levels of the spiral than you are. And how do we integrate that? I'm going to pivot here and very quickly talk about human history since Jesus over the last 2,000 years. You see a lot of purple, red, blue. That's why it's the Dark Ages, to be honest with you. That's why, because we cannot agree in a system. You got a third of the population in purple. They still believe in Zeus and lightning bolts, and they believe in God in that way. There's a third of the people who are red. They're trying to cast crusades and take over the world and find the Holy Grail and do all kinds of stupid stuff to us. And you got a whole bunch of people who are blue, and they want to build cathedrals, and then they want to worship God. And the problem is, every time they build a cathedral, the people in red come and they knock it down. Right? This is children and sandcastles at a beach played on a much larger scale. That's why it's the Dark Ages. That's why nothing happens. Not nothing, but we don't accomplish much. We don't go very far because we can't agree on who we are. And then medieval times, you see this more, but blue becomes incredibly prevalent. We have so much ritual and religion, and things get really fascinating, right? And then red people are inventing guillotines, and they're really happy about their guillotines. And blue people are establishing the church, and they're really happy. And purple people are still probably the majority of people, or a lot of people are still in that area. Then there's a big change that happens in the 1500s, the 1600s, and 1700s, where people start to question blue. They start to question why we always do things, and we don't question why we always do things that way. And then this guy, Martin Luther, comes up, and he's a total pain in the ass to the blue, who's telling you, hey, we came up with a new idea. If you pay for these indulgences, we're going to build a beautiful cathedral that you'll never get to go to because you're poor and you live in Germany. And this is only for the wealthy elite, and it's going to be in Italy, but it's going to be awesome, and you should just pay for it and not question it. Luther questions it. They don't answer his questions because they don't care about orange. They're like, this orange thing's going to die out. We're going to try and kill this guy. They don't. A prince takes his side. The prince is starting to wake up to orange. Martin Luther says, I need to retranslate the Bible into the language of the people. And he starts saying that people should be able to read the Bible and not just the people in church. And the people in church are saying Corpus Christi, right? They're speaking in Latin, even though none of the people in the pew speak Latin, because that's the language of God, apparently, is Latin. And you know what the people in the pews call Corpus Christi when they hear it? Hocus pocus. That is where the phrase hocus pocus comes from. It's the magic hands and the magic words said by the priest at the top. That is purple people being run over by blue in a society that's waking up to orange. And then Martin Luther's like, this doesn't make any sense to me. I want to be blue. I actually want to die Catholic, but you keep excommunicating me, which he responds to by burning the piece of paper where they excommunicate him. He burns the paper bull, which is the most orange thing that one could ever do. I'm going to think for myself. He writes the small catechism so that you can educate yourself and you can have it at home and do it with your children. He writes the large catechism because he thinks priests are mostly worthless and they need to get some school, so he writes that. He sits on his brains and writes all the time. He preaches a bunch of sermons, and his 95 theses are actually 95 questions that the Catholic Church refuses to answer. It's the classic orange situation. And we Lutherans have been riding that wave for 500 years. The problem is, the last time we were on the forefront of technology was Gutenberg, right? We haven't adapted because our world is very orange, and we're pretty happy with that on the whole. But then you get to the 20th century, and green shows up. This guy stands up and he says, I have a dream, and people go, yeah, that guy's right. And this Constitution says that all men are created equal, but some people only count as 3/5 of a person, and they can't vote, and women can't vote, and we need to change all of this stuff. And separate but equal is not equal, and. And then those green people start taking over churches. They start deconstructing everything, right? And the blue people and the red people and the orange people are like, I don't even know if I belong in my own church anymore. Because I can't just say who I am, I have to say he, him afterwards. Right? And all of these sermons are way too political for me, which is actually code for your politics don't agree with my politics. If what you heard from the pulpit agreed with you, you'd be fine with it. Let's be honest about that, okay? And I'm out of time. Then the 21st century, this is supposed to say the 21st century, sorry about that, we introduced yellow. And now we've got world leaders who started in the 20th century, but now we're following them, right? When Gandhi and MLK showed up, white folks weren't following that. And now we're like, oh no, I'm all about that. We need to live that integrated life. And this is where we find ourselves right now. And the comforting thing for me is that here in the 21st century, we have all of these colors on our global scale, and Jesus speaks all of these colors on a global scale. And if we want to make an actual difference in the world, we need to stop meeting people where we are and start meeting them where they are. And if we can do that, we can be the agents of change. We can be the reformers that Martin Luther wanted Lutherans to be. We can actually make the difference. But we can't do it by talking down to people. We have to integrate ourselves enough to stop condemning the parts of ourselves who used to believe things that no longer do, right? There was a time when I thought homosexuality was a sin, right? And I could pretend like that doesn't exist anymore because I'm ashamed of it. Or I could say, you know what, that guy woke up. And I want to help other people wake up. Not by judging them, not by condemning them, not by deconstructing them, but helping them on their journey, right? You can't stand on the third floor of a staircase and tell people it's easy, just walk. You have to go down where they are and hold their hand and help them. So anyway, that's my prayer for you. And next week we're going to talk about the Beatitudes, which are the most beautiful thing in the scriptures. And we're going to talk about how we can use this and the spiral dynamics and the Beatitudes to make the world a better place and live like Jesus. So thanks for coming today, and we'll see you next week.
We want to tell your parents what you said.
Okay, great. Appreciate that.